The grand hallway of the estate went deathly silent. Min Su, the ice-blooded chairman of the Seoul underworld, had just raised his hand to strike a man for an insult he didn't even commit. He thought the young girl clearing the tea was just furniture, a nameless, invisible maid in a beige uniform. He was wrong. Instead of flinching, Min Ji dropped into a deep, archaic bow, not the standard greeting of a servant, but the lost royal court salute of the northern nobility. As she whispered a single phrase in a dialect that had been dead for a century, the room turned to ice. Min Su's fist froze mid-air. In that moment, he realized this wasn't just a maid. She was the living legacy of a bloodline that had protected his ancestors for generations, and the only person in the world he was now required to bow to. The air inside the Kang estate didn't smell like jasmine or expensive incense today. It smelled of expensive cologne, old leather, and pure, suffocating terror. Faster! If there is a single fingerprint on those porcelain cups, you'll be out on the street before the sun sets, the head housekeeper hissed, her voice cracking with a panic she couldn't hide. She was a woman who prided herself on iron discipline, but today her hands were shaking so violently she had to hide them in her sleeves. It was 6 p.m. The black sedans were already pulling into the gravel driveway like a funeral procession. Min Ji adjusted her simple beige uniform, keeping her gaze fixed on the floor. At 24, she had mastered the art of being a ghost in her own life. She kept her hair in a low, severe bun and never wore jewelry, save for a small, tarnished silver locket hidden beneath her collar, the only remnant of a family history her parents told her to never, ever mention. "Min Ji!" the housekeeper barked, snapping her fingers. Min Ji flinched, her small frame tensing. "You are on tea service for the inner sanctum. Do not speak, do not look up. If you so much as breathe out of rhythm, it's over. Do you understand?" "I understand," Min Ji whispered, her voice barely audible. "Good, because Chairman Min Su is in a black dog mood tonight," the housekeeper whispered, crossing herself. "The last person who spilled tea in his presence hasn't been seen in 3 weeks." A cold shiver raced down Min Ji's spine. The name Min Su was spoken in hushed tones across all of Korea. He was the iron fist of the syndicate, a man who had built an empire on silence and sharp cheekbones. But as she picked up the silver tray, her hands weren't trembling because of his reputation. They were trembling because she recognized the tiger crest on the invitation cards. It was the same crest etched into the locket against her chest. The heavy iron gates of the Kang estate groaned open, admitting a procession of black sedans that cut through the evening mist like a funeral cortege. Inside the main hall, the silence was so thick it felt physical, pressing against the lungs of every staff member lined up in the foyer. Min Ji stood at the very end of the line, her small, delicate frame nearly swallowed by the shadows of the velvet curtains. She kept her hands clasped tightly at her waist, her knuckles white from the strain of maintaining a posture of perfect humility. Through the tall windows, the glare of headlights swept across the polished marble floors, signaling the arrival of the storm. The lead car, a custom armored limousine, came to a halt with a predatory smoothness. Before the engine had even cut out, the doors of the surrounding SUVs flew open in unison. A dozen men in razor-sharp black suits spilled out, moving with the synchronized lethal intent of a wolf pack. They formed a silent wall of power, their faces emotionless and alert, radiating a controlled threat that made the air in the estate turn frigid. These were not just guards, they were the ice-blooded elite, men who looked at the world through eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. Then the rear door of the limousine opened. Chairman Min Su stepped out, and the atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was an older man, his late 60s marked not by frailty, but a terrifying, weathered authority. Even from a distance, his presence was commanding, dressed in a dark tailored overcoat that seemed to absorb the light around him. He didn't look at the estate, he looked through it, his sharp cheekbones and stern expression suggesting a man who was already calculating the cost of the lives inside.
As she climbed the stone steps, the rhythmic thud of his heavy boots echoed through the hallway. It was a slow, deliberate sound, the heartbeat of a giant. Every step sent a fresh wave of anxiety through the staff. Minji felt the hair on her arms rise. She lowered her gaze even further, her heart hammering against the silver locket hidden beneath her beige collar. She could hear the rustle of his overcoat as he entered the foyer, the scent of expensive tobacco and cold rain trailing behind him like a shroud. Min-soo stopped mid-stride in the center of the hall, his eyes scanning the bowed heads of the servants. He didn't say a word, yet the silence he commanded was louder than a shout. His hand, large and calloused from decades of wielding power, was clenched into a tight fist at his side. To anyone else, it might have looked like a casual stance, but to Min-ji, it looked like a spring-loaded trap. She could feel his gaze pass over her, a brief, freezing touch that treated her as nothing more than a fixture of the house. He was a predator in a world of prey, and as he began to move toward the inner sanctum where the day's grim business awaited, Min-ji knew that the peace of the estate had died the moment he crossed the threshold. As the heavy doors of the inner sanctum clicked shut behind Chairman Min-soo and his wall of black-suited guards, the hallway exhaled a collective trembling breath. The tension didn't vanish, it simply settled into the floorboards, leaving the staff to move like shadows in a house that no longer felt like their own. Min-ji retreated toward the servants' quarters, her movements fluid and practiced, the result of years spent perfecting the art of being a ghost. In this sprawling estate, she was a non-entity, a girl whose only purpose was to ensure that the tea was hot and the silence was absolute. She reached the small, Spartan room she called her own, a space that held nothing but a narrow cot and a single wooden trunk. Here, away from the prying eyes of the head housekeeper and the security cameras that peppered the ceilings, Min-ji finally allowed her shoulders to drop. Her fingers went instinctively to the collar of her beige uniform, reaching for the cool, hard weight of the silver locket. She pulled it out, the metal tarnished, but the engraving of the tiger crest still sharp enough to prick her thumb. This was her secret burden, a piece of a life that ended before she was even born. Her parents had spoken of it only in whispers, telling her of a time when their family name didn't belong to servants, but to the Warong of the North, the protectors who stood between kings and the blade. They had warned her that in a new world, such history was a death sentence or a joke, and that her only safety lay in the beige fabric of her anonymity. She had lived by that rule for 24 years, scrubbing floors until her knees ached and taking the insults of wealthy guests without ever lifting her eyes. She stared at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror above her wash basin. The woman staring back looked fragile, her hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to pull at her very thoughts. But there was a quiet resolve in her gaze that didn't match her humble station. She thought of Min-soo's face, the weathered, cold authority that had momentarily unsettled her earlier. There was something about the way he carried himself that felt familiar, a jagged piece of a puzzle she wasn't supposed to solve. A sharp rap on the door broke her reverie. "Min-ji, the chairman wants his tea refreshed, and the head housekeeper has already fainted in the pantry. If you don't get in there now, the bodyguards will come looking for you." Min-ji tucked the locket back under her shirt, feeling the tiger crest press against her skin like a brand. She smoothed her apron, wiped the moisture from her palms, and stepped back into the world of yes sir and no sir. She was just a maid, a girl who faded into walls, but as she walked toward the lion's den, she felt the ancient blood of the protectors stirring in her veins for the very first time. The air inside the inner sanctum was no longer just cold, it was electrified, charged with the kind of volatile energy that precedes a lightning strike.
Minji entered the room with her head bowed so low she could only see the intricate patterns of the Persian rug and the polished leather shoes of the men who held the city's fate in their hands. The room was thick with the scent of bitter tea and the sharp metallic tang of adrenaline. Across the massive mahogany table, a rival associate was speaking, his voice trembling with a bravado that deceived no one, least of all the man sitting at the head of the table.
Chairman Min-soo sat perfectly still, his dark, tailored overcoat draped over his shoulders like a shroud. He hadn't touched his tea. His weathered face was a mask of stone, but his eyes, sharp and predatory, were fixed on the man across from him with a terrifying intensity. One of Min-soo's hands lay flat on the table, while the other was clenched into a white-knuckled fist, his thumb tracing the edge of a heavy glass tumbler. Every second of his silence felt like a minute, a slow-motion countdown toward an inevitable explosion. As Min-ji approached the table to refresh the service, the rival associate made a fatal mistake. He leaned forward, his voice rising in an ill-advised attempt at defiance, and accidentally brushed against a crystal water goblet. The glass tipped, sliding across the polished wood before shattering against the floor with a sound like a gunshot. The room froze. The bodyguards in the background shifted in unison, their hands moving toward the lapels of their suits, their faces radiating a controlled, lethal threat. The rival associate went pale, his breath hitching in his throat as he stared at the shards of glass at Min-soo's feet. Min-soo didn't flinch. Slowly, he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a haunting, guttural moan. The ice-blooded chairman looked down at the mess, then up at the man who had dared to bring chaos into his presence. The restraint that had held the room together for the last hour snapped. Min-soo's face twisted into an expression of cold, stern rage, and he raised his hand, not to point, but to strike. Min-ji, standing just inches away with her tray, felt the displacement of air as he moved. She knew that if she didn't act, the broken glass would be followed by broken lives. The stakes were no longer about a job or a reputation. They were about the blood that was about to be spilled on the carpet she had spent all morning cleaning. As Min-soo's fist tightened, signaling the end of his patience, Min-ji felt the locket beneath her uniform burn against her skin, a silent reminder of a strength she had spent a lifetime trying to hide. The silence following the shattered glass was more violent than the sound itself, a vacuum of sound that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. From the periphery, Min-ji saw the head housekeeper's face through the crack of the double doors. It was a mask of sheer horror, her eyes wide as she frantically gestured for Min-ji to move, to clean, to do anything to distract the monster before his hand fell. It was a suicide mission. To step between a predator and his prey was not service, it was a gamble with death. Min-ji's knees felt like water, her delicate frame trembling under the weight of the simple beige uniform that offered her no protection. She knew the rules of the house. The mess must vanish before the chairman's eyes could linger on it. With a breath that hitched in her throat, she stepped forward into the lion's den. Every step toward the mahogany table felt like walking into a freezing wind. The bodyguards, those emotionless walls of black-suited power, shifted their alert gazes toward her, their hands still hovering near their lapels. Min-soo's fist was a white-knuckled stone, frozen at the apex of his rage as he loomed over the rival associate. The man beneath him was shaking so hard his teeth clicked. His eyes darted toward the shards of crystal that glinted like diamonds in the dim light. Min-ji knelt. She didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the sharp edges of the broken glass near Min-soo's heavy, polished boots. The scent of the spilled tea was bitter and overwhelming, mingling with the cold, rain-drenched scent of the chairman's overcoat. Her hands, usually so disciplined and invisible, shook as she reached for the first shard. She could feel Min-soo's presence above her, a mountain of ice blood ready to crumble and crush everything beneath it. The atmosphere was suffocating, the tension in the room reaching a flashpoint where even the dust seemed to stop moving in the air. As her fingers brushed against a piece of glass, the silver locket beneath her collar swung forward, the metal tiger crest momentarily catching the light of the chandelier. She was a maid, a nobody, a girl meant to fade into the walls. But as Min-soo's shadow fell over her, and his breath hitched in a precursor to a roar of violence, Min-ji knew that the invisible girl was the only thing standing between the room and a bloodbath.
Min-soo's fist hovered in the air, a physical manifestation of a death sentence about to be carried out. The rival associate had squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the impact that would signal the end of his life, while the wall of bodyguards stood as silent, emotionless witnesses to the coming violence. Min-ji, still kneeling among the glinting shards of glass, felt a cold clarity wash over her, a sudden stillness that drowned out the frantic thumping of her heart. She knew that if she spoke in English, she would be ignored. If she begged, she would be discarded. Instead of retreating, she stood up with a fluid, haunting grace that seemed to belong to another century. She didn't look at the bodyguards or the trembling man at the table. Her gaze remained lowered, but her posture shifted from that of a broken servant to something far more ancient. As Min-soo's arm tensed for the strike, Min-ji dropped into a deep, elaborate bow, not the quick, shallow tilt of a modern maid, but the archaic, three-tiered royal court greeting used by the noble protectors of the northern provinces. The room seemed to lose its warmth entirely as she spoke. Her voice, usually a mere whisper that faded into the walls, now rang out with a melodic, crystalline authority. She uttered a single rhythmic phrase in a dialect so rare and old that it hadn't been heard in the streets of Seoul for 100 years, a dialect spoken only by those sworn to guard the high bloodlines of the North. The effect was instantaneous. Min-soo stopped mid-step, his clenched fist freezing inches from the associate's face. His authoritative face, usually a mask of weathered stone, cracked to reveal a flicker of raw, unadulterated shock. The air in the room didn't just feel cold, it felt as if time itself had been pulled backward by its roots. The bodyguards, sensing the shift in their master, hesitated, their alert eyes darting between the humble girl in the beige uniform and the man who was now staring at her as if she were a ghost risen from the grave. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the heavy, ragged breathing of the men in the room. Min-soo slowly lowered his hand, his fingers uncurling from their lethal grip. He didn't look at his rival, and he didn't look at his men. His eyes were fixed entirely on Min-ji, searching her lowered face for a sign that he hadn't just hallucinated a voice from his own buried past. The ice-blooded chairman was no longer a predator. He was a man who had just heard the echo of an ancestral debt he thought the world had forgotten. The silence that followed Min-ji's words was not the empty quiet of a room, but the heavy, ringing stillness of a vacuum. The bodyguards, trained to react to any sudden disruption with lethal speed, reached for the weapons concealed within their lapels, their faces hardening into emotionless masks of controlled violence. They were ready to eliminate the variable that had dared to break the chairman's focus. But Min-soo did not give the order. He remained frozen mid-step, his body a statue of restrained power and sudden jarring shock. One hand was still half-clenched, but the aggression had drained from his posture as if he had been struck by a physical blow. His weathered, authoritative face, which had survived decades of underworld wars without flinching, was now momentarily unsettled. He stared down on the small, delicate frame of the maid, his sharp cheekbones casting long shadows in the dim light of the sanctum.
"Stay your hands," Min-soo commanded, his voice a low, raspy rasp that cut through the tension like a blade. The bodyguards stopped instantly, their fingers still curled around their holsters, their alert eyes darting between the humble maid and the man who held their leashes. They were confused, radiating a controlled threat that hung in the air like a storm cloud, yet they obeyed the tremor of recognition they heard in their master's voice. Min-ji remained in her deep, archaic bow, her hands clasped tightly at her waist, her gaze fixed firmly on the polished floorboards. She could feel the weight of Min-soo's stare, a gaze that was no longer cold and dismissive, but burning with a desperate, haunted curiosity. The chairman took a slow, deliberate step toward her, the rhythmic thud of his boot echoing in the absolute quiet. He leaned in, his dark overcoat nearly brushing her shoulder, and for a moment, the ice-blooded boss looked almost vulnerable. The rival associate, forgotten and still trembling, watched from the table as the entire power dynamic of the room reversed. A single, humble figure in a beige uniform had halted the overwhelming authority of the Korean Mafia with nothing more than the sound of a forgotten world. Min-soo's breath hitched as he looked at the top of
"Stay your hands," Min-soo commanded, his voice a low, raspy rasp that cut through the tension like a blade. The bodyguards stopped instantly, their fingers still curled around their holsters, their alert eyes darting between the humble maid and the man who held their leashes. They were confused, radiating a controlled threat that hung in the air like a storm cloud, yet they obeyed the tremor of recognition they heard in their master's voice. Min-ji remained in her deep, archaic bow, her hands clasped tightly at her waist, her gaze fixed firmly on the polished floorboards. She could feel the weight of Min-soo's stare, a gaze that was no longer cold and dismissive, but burning with a desperate, haunted curiosity. The chairman took a slow, deliberate step toward her, the rhythmic thud of his boot echoing in the absolute quiet. He leaned in, his dark overcoat nearly brushing her shoulder, and for a moment, the ice-blooded boss looked almost vulnerable. The rival associate, forgotten and still trembling, watched from the table as the entire power dynamic of the room reversed. A single, humble figure in a beige uniform had halted the overwhelming authority of the Korean Mafia with nothing more than the sound of a forgotten world. Min-soo's breath hitched as he looked at the top of Min-ji's neatly tied bun, his face a landscape of disbelief and emerging memory. He had spent his life burying the past, yet here it was, standing before him in the form of a girl who was supposed to be invisible. Min-soo took a final, staggering step toward the girl, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor. The cold, stern mask he had worn for decades was gone, replaced by a look of haunting recognition that bordered on reverence. He leaned down, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of an entire history as he repeated the archaic phrase Min-ji had spoken. The ancient northern dialect felt heavy on his tongue, a language of honor and iron that had been buried under years of blood and business. "Where did you learn those words?" he asked, his voice trembling with a vulnerability that sent a wave of shock through his guards. Min-ji did not move from her deep bow, her hands still clasped tightly at her waist, but her heart hammered against the silver locket beneath her beige uniform. "My grandmother," she whispered, her voice steady despite the danger surrounding her. "She told me they were a promise that the shadows would always stand before the light." Min-soo's eyes widened, his sharp cheekbones tightening as the realization hit him like a physical blow. He looked at her small, delicate frame, the simple maid he had ignored, and finally saw the iron in her posture. His gaze traveled to her collar, where a thin silver chain was just visible against her skin. With a hand that was surprisingly gentle for a man of his reputation, he reached out, though he did not touch her. "The Guardians," Min-soo breathed, the words sounding like a prayer.
the family that stood by the tiger's side when the world was on fire. I was told your bloodline was extinguished in the mountains 60 years ago." He stepped back, his hand unclenched and resting at his side, no longer a weapon of violence, but a symbol of stunned respect. He ignored the rival associate and the confused wall of bodyguards behind him. In his mind, he wasn't in a luxury estate in the city. He was back in the stories of his grandfather, hearing of the legendary protectors who had saved their lineage at the cost of their own names.
"You are the last one," Minsu stated, his expression shifting from shock to a deep, solemn gravity. He looked at Minji not as a servant, but as the living ghost of his own survival. The power imbalance in the room had completely reversed. The Mafia boss, the man who held the city in a fist of ice blood, was now the one who seemed small in the presence of a girl who had spent her life fading into walls. The realization was absolute. The maid wasn't his property. She was his history. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the room, but its nature had changed. It was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of a profound, shattering reverence. Minsu stood motionless, his sharp cheekbones etched with a raw emotion that his bodyguards had never witnessed in all their years of service. Slowly, he turned his head toward the wall of black-suited men, his gaze as sharp as a winter wind. "Out," he commanded, the single word vibrating with an absolute authority that brooked no hesitation. The lead bodyguard stepped forward, his face a mask of confusion and alert concern. "Chairman, the security protocol, the rival associate is still—" "Out, all of you!" Minsu roared, his hand flashing in a sharp, dismissive gesture. "And take that coward with you. The meeting is over. If any of you set foot in this wing without my express summons, consider your lives forfeited." The room cleared in a blur of frantic, silent movement. The rival associate was hauled away, his face pale with a mix of terror and bewilderment, followed by the rhythmic thud of the bodyguard's retreat. When the heavy mahogany doors finally clicked shut, leaving only the chairman and the maid in the vast, shadow-filled sanctum, the atmosphere shifted from a battlefield to a shrine. Minsu turned back to Minji. She was still bowed, her hands clasped tightly at her waist, her small frame the only thing standing between him and the ghosts of his past. "Stand up," Minsu said, his voice losing its iron edge and becoming something softer, something almost pleading. Minji hesitated, her lowered gaze tracing the patterns on the rug. "I am just a maid, Chairman," she whispered, her voice reflecting the humility she had been forced to wear like a second skin. "No," Minsu replied, stepping forward until he was close enough to see the silver chain of the locket beneath her beige collar. "You are a daughter of the Guardians. In my grandfather's house, your ancestors sat at the right hand of the tiger. They did not bow to us, they stood beside us." He reached out, his weathered hand hovering near her shoulder before he pulled it back, as if afraid to break the moment. "I ask you, not as your master, but as a man who owes his very breath to your bloodline, stand, not as a servant, but as the equal you were born to be." Minji slowly lifted her head. For the first time, she looked the most feared man in Korea directly in the eye. Her hazel eyes were no longer clouded by fear or the need to be invisible. They shone with a quiet, ancestral resolve. As she straightened her back, the delicate frame of the maid seemed to expand, filling the room with a dignity that made the opulent estate look small. The ice-blooded boss didn't flinch. Instead, he bowed his head to her, a silent, staggering acknowledgement that the girl who faded into walls was now the most important person in his world. The golden light of the chandelier overhead seemed to dim, leaving the room in a soft, amber glow that felt more like a memory than a reality.
Minsu walked toward the heavy mahogany desk, his movements no longer sharp or aggressive, but slow and burdened by the weight of a story he had carried since childhood. Minji stood where he had requested, her back straight and her gaze steady, the silver tiger crest locket now resting openly against her beige uniform.
My grandfather was a young man when the northern borders collapsed, Minsu began, his voice dropping into the low, rhythmic cadence of a storyteller. He didn't look at her, he looked at his own hands, the same calloused hands that had built a criminal empire. He was being hunted through the frozen mountain passes by men who wanted to erase our name from history. He was alone, wounded and certain that the snow would be his grave. He turned back to Minji, his eyes searching hers for a connection to that distant past. But the shadows in those mountains were not empty. Your great-grandfather was the head of the Guardian line, the elite warriors who had served as the secret shield for the northern clans for centuries. He found my grandfather bleeding in a shrine. Instead of fleeing to save his own family, he stood at the entrance of that mountain pass for 3 days and 3 nights. Minsu took a breath, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He held the pass against 20 men, armed with nothing but a ceremonial blade and the conviction of his bloodline. He bought the time my grandfather needed to escape across the river. When the fighting was over, the Guardians vanished into the mist, taking their names and their honor with them to protect the survivors. The chairman reached into his dark overcoat and pulled out a small, worn photograph, its edges yellowed with age. He laid it on the table between them. In the image, a stern man in traditional northern robes stood beside a younger version of Minsu's grandfather. The man in the robes wore a familiar silver locket around his neck, the twin to the one Minji held. My grandfather told me that if I ever heard the words of the northern greeting, it would mean the debt was due, Minsu whispered, his expression one of profound solemnity. He said that a tiger never forgets the one who guarded his path when he was weak. For 60 years, our family has flourished because of the sacrifice yours made in the snow. Minji felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The stories her parents had whispered to her weren't just fairy tales to comfort a lonely girl. They were a map of her own identity. The invisible maid was gone, replaced by the realization that she was the living embodiment of a debt that even the most feared man in Korea could never fully repay. The following morning, the Kang estate awoke to a world that had fundamentally shifted on its axis. The suffocating dread that usually permeated the hallways was replaced by a bewildered, watchful silence as the staff witnessed a sight that defied every unspoken rule of the household. Minji still wore the simple beige uniform of her station, her hair still pulled back into its disciplined bun. But the invisible girl had vanished, replaced by a woman who walked with the quiet, unshakable grace of the northern nobility. She no longer scrubbed the floors or hurried at the bark of the head housekeeper. Instead, she was found in the inner sanctum, seated not at a side table, but in a plush chair directly to the right of Chairman Minsu. The silver tiger crest locket was no longer hidden beneath her collar. It rested openly against her chest, a shimmering badge of a bloodline that commanded more respect than any weapon. The transformation was absolute. When the bodyguards entered the room, they no longer looked through her as if she were furniture. They bowed, deeply and with genuine, alert respect, before they even acknowledged the chairman. Minsu himself seemed transformed. The ice-blooded predator now carried a calm, paternal gravity. He made no decision, signed no contract, and issued no orders without first glancing toward Minji, seeking the silent ancestral wisdom that lived in her hazel eyes.
Outside the estate, the rumors spread like wildfire through the Seoul underworld. The chairman had found a guardian, a living ghost of the old world who acted as his conscience and his shield. Min-ji remained at the estate, but she was no longer a prisoner of her own shyness or her poverty. Her stutter had disappeared, replaced by the crystalline authority of her true heritage. She had found her voice, her security, and a purpose that stretched far beyond the walls of the kitchen. She was the untouchable Maid, the only person in the world to whom the most feared man in Korea would ever bow. The debt of the tiger had finally been repaid, and in the heart of the city, a protector had finally come home.